And so I think that looking at the ways that we understand the traditions is one place where to the extent that we're going to think of these as being separate traditions is a way of gaining something from that. And one example that would be, I think, a good one to play with here is the notion of kairos. In Margaret's book, in Mad at School, she writes a lot about kairotic spaces, right? And among everything from like the university or school itself to the job interview process. And for me, it was really interesting in reading that to think about kairos as a space. And this is coming back, I think, to the question of sort of materiality. In the way that I was taught kairos in the speech tradition, kairos is more a moment. Right? Thinking about it as a space didn't make any more sense really than thinking about the speech as being the space in which it takes place. Although that's something that I've become increasingly aware of, and maybe even had a lot to do with why I started looking at ableism in the first place, is because the ways that we construct spaces do speak, right? Stairs talk. They have, they're a sign that says, walkies only, right? And until you look at them that way, you don't hear that. So the construction of spaces is something that I've become much more aware of. But the tradition that I was taught would look at kairos and say, kairos, and that's K-A-I-R-O-S, I'm sorry, is something that occurs when theory and practice diverge. When there's this space that opens up between them. And that space we call crisis, K-R-I-S-A-S, or crisis, right? And that's what occurs when what's supposed to happen in theory and what's happening in practice don't mesh up, right? They diverge. And so that's a moment, a kairotic moment, in which there's an invitation to criticism, right? To me, that's what criticism is. It's responding to that moment in which theory and practice don't work. You step up to the elevator, you push the button, the elevator's supposed to come, the door's supposed to open. If it doesn't, you have to rethink the situation, you have to evaluate it, you have to make an analysis, you have to decide what to do, so that's critique. So that, I think, is a place where, kairos is, and thinking of kairos as a space is an example of where the tradition that I sort of was raised with didn't think about it in the ways that it's clear, or at least to me, that I get the sense of from your book. So.
To be honest, I was using kairotic as an adjective. The space was intended to be the conference or the job interview or whatever the space we were in. And I was thinking of these spaces as kairotic because I thought of the timing that needed to occur in them as being so split second and the stakes being so high and the choices that had to be made so hair's breadth. That kairotic, to me, seemed like the concept I needed to explain the timeliness of these moments. And I think of that term timely as not meaning the right time and the good time. I think that in the 70s and 80s in the rhetorical tradition, kairos was often read in a very positive light. Someone who had timeliness, sort of had grace and facility and fluidity. And then I think scholars, for example, Cynthia Michnikowski-Sherd, and we can just say Cynthia Sherd, S-H-E-A-R-D, has called, I think, our attention very importantly to ways that kairos is not always a positive, fluid, everything coming trippingly off the tongue kind of event. And one thing I love about Sherd's approach to kairos is that she points out it has ethical dimensions. It points out ethical dimensions in the rhetorical situations we're in. And what I thought was interesting about the spaces in academia that I named kairotic spaces was, for some people, they are very smooth and fluent. And for some people, they are incredibly choppy and fraught. So one example that I like to think of is a graduate student being taken out to lunch by his or her advisor. And I think this is an example that actually ended up in Mad at School. And put it in there because I was imagining myself as this stressed out graduate student. It's a very common thing in academia for an advisor to say to a grad student, I'd love to get to know you better, or I'd like to talk this over, or whatever, let's go to lunch. Let me take you to lunch. And I think it's very common for the advisor, or whoever's having a more fluent kairotic experience, which is usually, and not incidentally, the person with more power, to think, how nice, I am treating them to lunch. This is such a treat. And I don't know how many students would have the kind of experience that I would have in those situations, which is, oh God, that sounds very stressful for a variety of reasons, ranging from the fact that you might have to manage food at the same time that you're managing a conversation, or you might have to try to remember things, or you might simply have to appear graceful and sort of gesturally easy. I'm thinking of the wonderful panel on gesture that I went to earlier today, that Elizabeth, what was your last name? That Elizabeth Miller and others presented. Bringing those things together is, and doing it with kairos, having timeliness in a moment like that can be incredibly fraught, or it can be quite easy and difficult to notice, difficult to even apprehend why that might be difficult. And what really interested me about the spaces I was calling kairotic spaces was that, let's imagine right now that we just have two interlocutors, the advisor and the advisee, the inviter and the invitee, is that they could be having a completely different experience of kairos. One person could see the lunch as quite enjoyable and easy and smooth and spontaneous, and the other person could see it as intensely, as labor intensive, as exhausting, as requiring a huge amount of preparation, as not fluent at all. And that's what I really thought was interesting about kairos, and that's what I wanted to make the defining characteristic of spaces I was calling kairotic spaces, is that, as Sherd says, if we attend to the moral dimension of these spaces, we can understand that different rhetors may or may not be experiencing kairos, which is, I think, something that classical rhetors, or at least Plato and Aristotle, maybe we should get into the sophists. I think the sophists would say they're totally aware that different writers could be having a different apprehension of a particular space, whereas perhaps Plato and Aristotle would have a less easy time apprehending that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that just a short thing to append, which is it's accessing the kairotic space that I think becomes, for me, in the way that you write about it here, that's the unique part of it that sort of escaped the way that I would think of kairos, right? I mean, thinking about accessing kairos, that was just a twist. I mean, for me, that's a whole different reorientation, because I could see looking at that situation that you were just describing and saying, well, the one person isn't timely because they're not in the right frame, right? And versus somebody having access to it and it being something that's built through a kind of sense of universal design or being readily available to others and so on. To me, this is a good example, though, of the kind of thing that the conversation can do, because of just the different sort of nuances that that we pick up and bring to it. In the interest of time, we're going to move, I think, to the fourth question.
Yes.
And you're going to be starting us on that. Would you like to read it?
Yes. I think I forgot to read the second question, sorry. Our fourth question, and I think this is the first one we actually got really excited about. Is it more useful to say that disability studies is a disciplinary approach, that it is a discipline? We talked a fair amount about disciplinarity while we were having our prep conversations. Or would it be more accurate to say that it is a kind of rhizomatic cluster of approaches that tend to go under one name? Disability studies scholars approach many parallel ideas circulating in the field in substantially different ways. For example, methods of studying ableism, which we've mentioned, or how, quote unquote, the normal is conceived and studied. For example, we could examine the normal from a historical literary stance, as Leonard Davis has, or from a contemporary political argument stance, as many people who identify as rhetoricians do. And each of these would reflect different assumptions about rhetorical theory and practice. Because we're closing in on our self-appointed time for us to sit here and jaw. I'm just going to mention, I'm going to mention what I wanted to talk about here very briefly. I think we can very loosely agree that disability studies has arrived in English studies this year, 2014, in a way that it had not arrived in 1999. Now, that doesn't mean that studying disability studies is easy or easily rewarded. It doesn't mean that graduate students going on the job market don't agonize over how to position themselves. But you know, to some degree, it is, as Rosemary Garland Thompson has said, a field emerged. In that emergence, I have perceived some gaps in resources that concern me. And we can talk more about these during the open discussion if people are interested. But very briefly, first of all, I'm concerned about the gap between scholars who identify as doing disability studies, I feel compelled to put scare quotes around doing, and the people who identify the Society for Disability Studies as their home discipline. Now, maybe this is a sign of the robust interdisciplinarity that marks academia today, or maybe it's a sign that disability studies now confers enough cultural capital within academia that people perhaps don't need the Society for Disability Studies anymore. And that's a genuinely troubling question for me, and it's an open question, and I'm not sure what to do with it. The second resource gap that I perceive, and again, this is a very personal and a very open question for me, I perceive a gap between the people who discuss access and exhort accessible practices and the number of people who actually do this in everyday life or in everyday academic practice. And again, I'm not sure what to do about that. I mean, I don't want to like just sort of be like, what's wrong with people? But I wonder why does that gap occur? Why is it that it is relatively easy? And I'm speaking here largely of my experiences within rhetoric and composition. Why is it relatively easy to sort of say that access is a good thing, but then perhaps not to get as specific about how to practice access as we might? That's all I'll say on that for now.
Well, and I think that the speech rhetoric position has been, or tradition has also had a similar response to access, that it's something that there's been widespread agreement, this is a good idea, this is something we need to be thinking about. But then the move to it is often, okay, let's set out a series of guidelines and prescriptions that we have to follow, and that these are the right ways to make access, and that this is accessible and that this isn't, and it makes essentially it looks at access from an ableist perspective, I think. And I really like the idea that we need to find sort of new ways of thinking about ableism and access. And I mean, we keep picking on Jay, so I'm sort of glad that he's here. But the idea of it as a way to move, right, which is that thinking about articulating, access as a kind of movement, right? We becomes not just a way to move in terms of flowing from one room to another and having the ability to go through the door, but also movere, right? M-O-V-E-R-E, movement of the mind, right? Moving how we think and how we imagine others and what motivates us to act. I think that's a useful conception that speech rhetoric needs to adopt. It's, like you said, at conferences, in my case, the National Communication Association, the NCA conferences, access has been something that we've been working on for a long time, and there's been, we've always had widespread agreement from the Executive Council and the people who run the NCA that this is something that needs to be done, but what gets done over the years has been, well, it's been an ongoing process. I've actually sort of informally been a kind of liaison for a number of years. I chair the Disability Studies Caucuses, Disability Issue Caucuses Accessibility Committee, which essentially means that over the years when there's been an access problem, I'm the person that they go find, and then I go find the people who are running NCA and we try to deal with it. And that's, the NCA has always been open to it, but they haven't been very perceptive of the kinds of things that need to be done beforehand. I think that's probably been the experience for a lot of people. SDS, one of the things that I think we will always get out of SDS is it's probably the most accessible conference you can go to, at least in the United States. There's been more attention to access, I think, at SDS than anywhere else that I'm aware of. I mean, and I think they've done a really good job. If you have never gone to a Society for Disability Studies conference, I recommend it. So, should we turn it over to them? Did you have
Let's do it. We hit time. Thank you so much, Amy, for helping keep us close to the line there. And I think we can just sort of open it up for wider conversation. New issues, new topics, or possibly a return to things that we've already raised. Whatever people want to talk about.
One of the major differences between the two disciplines from a disability standpoint for me is that there are certain I'm sorry.
Could I ask people to say their names before they speak?
Oh.
Thank you.
My name is Thomas Wright. Any other information you need or just, okay. Anyway, one of these differences is that there are certain disabilities that will push people more towards or away from one of these approaches. So, for example, I'm profoundly deaf. I'm very fascinated by speech communication, but I would feel uncomfortable in a department where they would be asking me to teach it. And I'm wondering if this aspect of the situation has led scholars to go more into one area or more into another area where their knowledge and their experiences would be influencing maybe more speech communication or more rhetoric and composition because of that. And I don't have enough reading experience in disability studies myself to have any input on that. Have you seen anything like that happen?
Well, what's your perception of it? Do you think that that's occurred?
I know for a fact that there are deaf scholars, for example, who have gone into rhetoric and composition because of their background and doing a lot of reading and being much more in touch with the written word. Now, as to whether something similar is happening in speech communication, for example, I have some students who are very bright, they're very interested in rhetoric, but they're not comfortable with the written side of it because of certain learning disabilities they have, and that might push them more towards speech communication.
Okay.
Now, as to how much that might end up influencing the research itself, that's what I don't know, so that's a question that I'm throwing out here.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned, Margaret mentioned that she studied American Sign Language as one of your languages in grad school. I did the same thing. And although, I mean, I really don't feel I'm at all fluent in it, it was really a useful way of understanding a different perspective on language, on the relationship between gesture and sign and communication and speech. Because historically, at least from the communication studies perspective, which I think ultimately has influenced or is influenced by, or vice versa, the general tradition that hasn't recognized until somewhere around the time Bill Stokoe wrote the first dictionary of American Sign Language, that's Stokoe, I think. His dictionary was one of the first things that made it clear that sign language, American Sign Language at least, is a different language. It's not simply a matter of a coded version of English. There are coded versions of English. There's several of them actually. But ASL is an entirely different language. Among other things, it's like 60% of it's dependent on French signs because the first signers at Gallaudet University were from France. And so taking that was one of the things that brought it into my attention, or I was able to really get a sense of it as being something that was related to speech, that was related to the kinds of nuances that we talk about when we talk about someone being a great speaker. There are great signers. And even from somebody with as little a background as I have, I mean, you notice them. When you see someone who signs at SDS, for instance, and is just really good at it to the point where it's beautiful. I mean, there's some people who are just phenomenal signers, just as I think there are some people who are incredible speakers. And so the point was that that's something that the tradition in communication studies has generally ignored. Most often, the place that you'll find any discussion of American Sign Language is in nonverbal communication, right? In courses and books on nonverbal communication, which is not nonverbal communication. It's verbal, but it's the signs, right? The words are signed. It's very much verbal communication in the sense that it's based on verba, on word. So I guess my answer would be that yeah, if there is a tendency that's been reified by these sort of assumptions, it's something that we should think about and be willing to move away from. And one that's probably, unfortunately, been reinforced by how the disciplines have been developed. That's my take on it. What do you think?
I have thought a lot about why I am so drawn to inscription as a practice. I was always more of a writer than a talker. And to some degree, I locate that in certain things about the way I was brought up. Or just sort of the sum of my experiences that has brought me to where I am. I do think this reminds me of something that I didn't have time to mention when we were dialoguing on our questions, which is that I'm very interested in the relationship between disability studies as an academic practice and experience or relationship to. There's this interesting, I don't want to say requirement, but there's kind of a call to witness one's own relation to disability when you study disability. When I was going on the job market in 2004, I was completely prepped on the question, how did you get interested in this subject? Because I got asked it on every single interview. And I think particularly for people whose disabilities may be less obviously marked, you're frequently asked to sort of account for your presence in this field. I hadn't really thought about who might gravitate to speech versus writing very much. I think that's an interesting question. It's one I would be interested to hear other people speak about it as well.
Are we answering you? Oh, sorry.
Another question.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Even if I bring the conversation a little bit farther away from here. So I'm also focusing on question number 2, and I kind of want to push you. Oh, my name is Mary.
Thank you.
I kind of want to push you to answer a bit more specifically, if that's okay, because the last part of that question says, how does the two traditions define writing? And then above that, we have, what is the impact on approaches to disability access? And I would like you to maybe comment on how that has affected the way that you teach, both in composition and in speech, because as someone who teaches writing, I find that to be really difficult, is making a writing class accessible to someone who may have different styles of learning or different, just different, who I just find that to be really difficult when what you're trying to teach is writing, and that's kind of the goal. So when you say more about that, great.
Just to clarify, when you're saying the difficulties, are you talking about difficulties with modes of communication or literacy or
I
both?
would say kind of all of it. So how do you
Okay.
take a universal design approach in that context? Because you are focusing on teaching a specific thing that really does force you to have some boundaries on people's ability, or to place some boundaries on that.
I'd actually love to hear from an audience member about this. Jay, not to put you on the spot, Jay, but
We've done that already.
I know. The quote is a way to move from Jay's work actually applies to universal design for learning. And Jay has written so beautifully about this, and also about what it means to engage multiple modes in the classroom. I'm wondering if I can
Sure.
ask you to say a few things about that.
This is Jay. I was thinking about it from a slightly different angle, but I realized it's the same thing, that it is about universal design in a way, but because I was thinking some of the same things, that the reasons why, when I really look at it, why did I come into writing / rhetoric, right? It's because people told me I was good at writing, or at least they noticed I was doing a lot of it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But when it comes to teaching, that's not an advantage. It maybe takes a while to realize that, right? But being good at something does not make you, or doing a lot of something,
Yes.
does not make you a good teacher of that thing, right? And there's a little bit of a false demarcation too, because actually, I say this all the time, and it is really true, but it sounds like a kind of, I don't know, platitude or something, but I've become better as a teacher to the degree that I stopped teaching as though all my students were like me,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think that's, something you come to, right? But the truth of it is, the best writing teachers do a lot more than writing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the pathways to a written text, right, are really various, right? And they come through a range of other modalities, right? Thinking about Elizabeth's work this morning, working with people who are using multimodal means to get past some communication blocks, right? Well, that's just all of communication. That's rhetoric, right? So I don't know exactly where I'm going with this, except that, when in disability studies specifically, when you say, oh yes, I also teach writing, it's kind of like, oh. It's hard for people to really understand. And I know Robert McCurt's chapter in Crip Theory, where he sort of looks at, okay, well, I also work within an English department that teaches writing. What does that mean? Writing is the production of order, right? It's all of these other things, right? And to a certain degree, I know because he's told me, he was like, oh, I was afraid people were going to get really, really upset. People in composition theory or writing theory were going to read that and get really upset. It's like, no, they loved it. Because it's what we're all thinking too. We're all deeply skeptical, right, of the single means of getting at expressing, right, what it is, how we want to make meaning, how people want to make meaning. So, and universal design then becomes not a set of practices necessarily, but can be a kind of philosophical way, a constant reminder, right, not to focus on what works for you only, not to focus on what you do the most of, or whatever else.
One thing to get specific, and I think that's a great reminder that it is important to be specific when we talk about things like how we teach, how we theorize. In fact, that reminds me of Linda Martine Alkoff's keynote, in which she said, you always have to get specific to get at the ethical truth of a situation. One thing that I try to do, and I had a similar path to realization as Jay did, my students don't love receiving assignments that are 2 pages single-spaced typed. I was genuinely shocked. I was like, there's so much information. My students were like, we hate it. This is exhausting. Where's the assignment? I was like, the whole thing. And they'd be beautifully written, and I would have revised them anyway. Number one, to me, it feels very important to say and say and say again in the classroom exactly what Jay said. There is no single path to the particular artifact you're trying to arrive at. Whether that artifact is a well-delivered speech or a semi-spontaneous speech act like an interview, or an essay or a lab report, whatever it is you're trying to arrive at, there is no single right path to get there. And I try to emphasize over and over again, because this is not one of those things that you can say once and sort of expect that it will stick. I'm offering a range of possible paths. So sometimes we will write in the classroom and I will just have everyone do the writing right there. But then I will never collect that writing. I will never put a time limit on what students are doing. I will just ask them to get done whatever they can get done in that 15 minutes, and then we'll do something with it. The classroom will involve conversation, which is probably torturous for some of my students. I personally detest small group work. We'll spend some time typing. We'll spend some time drawing. Patricia Dunn has an amazing book titled, oh, you know this book, Talking, Sketching, Moving. That, you know, it's like the joy of cooking for multimodal teaching. It's awesome. So I try to offer the widest range of possibilities I can, but it is a semester-long project, and really more than a semester, but a semester is all I have, to keep unbuilding that notion that there is a specific recipe or a specific pathway to whatever the rhetorical task at hand is.